Thank you for listening to this resource provided by Westwood Baptist Church. Listen as Pastor Steve Smart brings a message of hope in Jesus Christ.
Amen. Nothing better than Jesus, right? Well, I tell you, if they had sung that song in the Pentecostal church I grew up in, they'd have been running the aisles on that one, man. I mean, it would have been cray-cray in that place. And but we're the frozen chosen, so we keep everything okay, keep it all under control. There you go. There you go. Well, if you have your Bibles, and I hope you do, let's take them out and let's read the scripture here, Genesis chapter 19. Genesis chapter 19, our text begins in verse 1. We closed chapter 18 with Abraham returning to his tent as the Lord departed from him. It was really, I hope you really grasped what we read there as we were looking at chapter 18. It was an incredible closing to the chapter, as the Lord shared with Abraham his plan to visit the cities of the plain. Now, he's traveling there to confirm what was already evident, that the wickedness of the people had become so egregious that it warranted divine attention, and the guilty verdict of judgment was now inevitable. And so, hearing this, Abraham presented himself to the Lord, and he petitioned on behalf of those in the city, those who were righteous, who would be caught up together with the wicked and be punished for the sins of another. Specifically his nephew Lot, who's now living not near Sodom, not only in Sodom, but as one who has become integrated into the political and the social function of its society. So, obviously, knowing Lot is to be one of those who would be among them, Abraham prays for the people. That's what we read in chapter 18. He prays on account of the righteous, on behalf of the innocent. And the progressive negotiation of his prayer reveals how it is that we should pray. You see, if we were really paying attention to chapter 18, that should show us exactly how it is that we should pray, how we should pray for those who are surely destined for the wrath of God's judgment because of their rebellion against him. And as we listened in, we heard that Abraham's appeal to the Lord on behalf was simple. He doesn't try to negotiate an alternative plan for justice. He doesn't pray for their blessing. He simply prays for nothing but mercy. And he prays in humility. You see, when you listen to Abraham's prayer, you'll notice he never prays imposing demands upon the Lord, no criticism of God's justice, and he insists no obligations that he should be held to on our account. He prays in humility, and he's persistent. I think if there's one thing that we saw as we read through chapter 18 and Abraham's negotiation with the Lord is that constant persistence. He didn't drone on and on. He just kept on asking, petitioning, requesting. And it was an honest plea, acknowledging that God is good, that he's merciful, that he's just, and that he's revealed himself to be this through this faith, his faithful and loving goodness. And how did it end? The Lord accepted his prayer. And so out of Abraham's very simple, humble, persistent, honest plea, God accepts his prayer. If only 10 righteous can be found, then the cities will be spared. Just 10. Among all those people in the cities, just 10. Surely there will be 10. And as Abraham returns to his tents, the Lord departs and the two angels continue on towards Sodom. So let's pick up where we left off in our text as we turn into the chapter 19. Genesis 19, beginning in verse 1. Now, as Abraham departs, I want you to get the scene. As Abraham departs from the Lord, the night is beginning to close in. It's been a long day already. Remember, they showed up. Abraham goes out of his tent. He bows down. He fixes this meal. He gets them all set. And then he takes them into the path where they're getting ready to go toward. Night is beginning to fall in. And you can imagine, because of the lower sea level, all this thing it's hot. And it's humid. And by the time he reaches the light of his tents, the two angels, probably by supernatural travel, have made their way past the Judean forest. They're into the plain. And they're arriving, just as Abraham is arriving at the lights of his tents. These angels are arriving at the gates of the city in Sodom. Verse 1. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. So you can imagine here, when it says it's evening, it's probably about dusk. The sun has begun to set. The sky is lit up with the colors of the setting sun. And you can imagine, as I said, because it's a lower sea level, remember we're 3,000 feet below sea level in Sodom. It's going to be hot and it's going to be humid. And the gate of Sodom would have been the entrance to the city. Just like an ancient agora, it would have been an open space where people gathered. They gathered there to do business, to discuss legal issues, or just to gossip, which is probably why Lot is seated at the gate. If for no other reason, then there was probably more of a breeze as it passed through, as opposed to being inside the city. When I was in high school, the school that Cheryl and I attended was divided into three main halls. The way the school was set up, you had A hall, B hall, and then you had C hall. And all of it was open balcony, 2 levels to it. And because our school was among the only ones in Duval County that didn't have air conditioning, and for those of you who have ever been there, Jacksonville, Florida boils around noon on every day except winter, which is only one day in January. That's pretty much what Jacksonville, Florida is like. So the roar of box fans filled the air of Terry Parker Senior High School. But if you were going to get any kind of natural breeze, it was going to pass through the middle of B Hall. On the first level, not on the upper level, but on the first level, that breeze would just kind of carry through B Hall. And that was where they'd put the announcement board. And it was also where a wide clearing for students to gather around. That's kind of what I think about when I try and picture this gate to the city of the plain. But there's another thing that was interesting about B Hall that I think is similar to the city gate, and that is that it would have been a place where everyone went because they were cool. It was the place to go to gather, to socialize, if you wanted to do such a thing. And such would have been the place of the gate of the city towards Sodom. The people who gathered there, the people who sat at its gate, would have been people of influence, celebrities, lawmakers, politicians. And notice in our text who it is that's seated there. Lot is seated right there among them. Now I want you to think about that for just a minute. Try and picture what's happening here. I want you to think back in chapter 13, right? Go all the way back in your memory, back to chapter 13, when Lot and Abraham separated for the first time. Remember? Remember how Abraham said, you go your way, I'll go my way. Lift up your eyes. Which way do you want to go? And remember where Lot chose? He chose the region of the plain. Why? You remember why? It was because he saw he was drawn to its beauty. He looked out, he saw it was well watered, he saw that it was a lot of vegetation. So as he looked out, he saw its beauty and he saw opportunities that might be afforded the residents there. So he moved his tent. Verse 12 of chapter 13 says he moved his tent as far as Sodom. In other words, he kept a safe distance, but he had a convenient drive into the city with a good view of the mountains behind him. But then in chapter 14, he's described in verse 12 as being dwelling in Sodom. No longer living in the suburbs. He's bought a penthouse overlooking the streets of the city. Now in chapter 19, look where he's at. He's sitting in the gate of Sodom because Lot's become a prominent citizen there. You see, where once he just kind of looked at it, he was attracted to it, he moved that direction, but then he moved inside the city. Now he's a man of influence. Now he's sitting in the gate. He's popular enough to hang around B Hall. Right? It says when Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth. So far, so good, right? Because that's what Uncle Abraham looked like. Just as Abraham fell prostrate when he greeted the Lord and the two angels, Lot does something very similar here, verse 2. And he said, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way." So maybe there's hope, right? If we just kind of stop the story right there. Maybe there's hope. Maybe Lot has held on to his upbringing. Maybe what he learned from Abraham he's been able to hold on to. Because just like his uncle, the tradition of hospitality was important. And just like Abraham, he offers them rest and a meal. But look what it says. They said no. Now, we'll spend the night in the town square. That's not what Lot expected. Because just as the custom was to offer a bed and breakfast, the custom was to accept it. You see, it was just as offensive to deny something of hospitality as it was to not offer it. But Lot's not going to take no for an answer. Verse 3, but he pressed them strongly. In other words, and as some scholars have put it, he manhandled them. He became very insistent. He did some major arm twisting until they finally accepted. Verse 3 goes on, says, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Now the meal wasn't quite the caliber as the one Abraham had fed them earlier that day. Abraham, if you remember, gave them steak and potatoes. Lot gave them mayonnaise sandwiches and a Little Debbie. That's pretty much all he got up for them. It was actually some sort of like an unleavened cake, like a biscuit that could be baked in a hurry. But in Lot's defense, given the hour, it was probably the best thing that he could come up with. Because for Lot, this is more than just being a good host. It's more than just hospitality. You see, Lot knows what happens in Sodom when defenseless strangers remain outside at night. He didn't insist that they come to his home simply because he was going to be a good host. He insisted because he was afraid. He knew what the people of Sodom were like. He knew that the people of Sodom were self-indulgent, self-possessed, vile, and wicked. He knew that they were given to violence and sexual deviance, demanding and intemperate. You see, Lot was afraid because he knew what the streets of Sodom would become under the cover of darkness, because nothing good happens after midnight. But for now, at least, as it appears, the men are safe in Lot's home. They're fed, and they're prepared to rest for the night. And by the time we get to the end of verse 3, we can all kind of take a deep breath, sigh of relief. But then verse 4. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house. Notice that this isn't just a couple of them, right? It isn't a small group of deviants who are out juking through the town. This is the men, look, the men of the city, both young and old, all the people to the last man. In other words, every man, now think about it, I want you to wrap your mind around this. Every man from every corner of the city and from every age group. That means, and you got to really wrap your mind around it, that means fathers and their sons and their grandfathers. No exceptions. It's kind of like, if you look at verse 4, it's kind of like a horror movie. I mean, if you try to picture it really. They all surrounded Lot's house. Some of you have seen that show, The Walking Dead. You ever seen that show? Or maybe some of you a little older, The Creature Feature. Remember that we used to watch? The zombies as they're surrounding the CEO. There's that constant, unrelenting pursuit. That's kind of what the image is. Right? But this really happened. This was no TV show. These men are unrelenting as they surround the house. Every man and young boy surrounding this place. I want you to really kind of envision it if you can. Verse 5, and they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them." Now that last phrase has been the source of a lot of debate among biblical scholars and more recently among social media theologians. What did they mean when they said that we may know them? It means exactly what you think it means. And any effort to soften their intent, any effort to redefine their demand, it's a shameless folly. Homosexuality had become a dominant way of life in Sodom and a common perversion for the Canaanites. But here in Sodom, that culture had descended even further into sexual violence, and their sexual immorality was pervasive. I think an accurate illustration of this scene would portray a ghastly and horrific image of savage terrorism. Their feral intent is obvious in the way that they surrounded the house before they even called out to those who were inside. And then once they had every exit of the house fully covered, that's when they called out their demands. Bring them out to us that we may know them. They make no pretense about what they're there for. As one pastor put it, his home was encircled by a vast, gibbering mob of lusting men of every age, howling for perverted satisfaction. These men, old and young, fathers and sons, openly announced their intent to assault these men sexually. Now, the sin for which Sodom is judged is evident, and their guilt is confirmed. Verse 6. So Lot went out to the men at the entrance, and he shut the door after him. And he said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly." My brothers. Now, Lot, the man who until this afternoon was seated among these men, his brothers, as he refers to them, who considered himself a brother of these scoundrels, now he's going to become their mediator. But rather than confront the wickedness of the people, rather than speaking as a voice of what's right and true, Lot's going to offer a compromise that's going to distract their lust. Kind of like throwing a piece of meat into a pack of lions to distract them. And his compromise is unconscionably monstrous. Verse 8. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. Any effort on Lot's part to be gracious or good is now eclipsed by this cowardly and disgusting proposal. Lot may have been conflicted, even tormented by the sins of his neighbors. In fact, the Apostle Peter in his second letter says that Lot was, quote, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked. But in spite of that, Lot has been so compromised by his association with their sin that he can't even think straight. His moral compass is tilted. He can't reconcile which is more important, the protection of his own daughter's purity or his obligation to be a good host. He's willing, I want you to wrap your mind, he's willing to surrender his own daughter over to salacious abuse rather than have as guests men he's never even met before, rather than have them ill-treated or threatened. Lot is a conflicted soul. He was at the same time both offended and enticed by Sodom. He was tormented inside by the filth of wicked men, but he craved the prestige of the recognition he was given when he was seated at the city gates. He benefited from the prosperity. He enjoyed the comforts of the culture, the entertainments, the pleasures, the amusements, but his moral compass derailed. His judgment of what was right and wrong had been damaged, and when the moment of testing came, he placed the sanctity of hospitality over the sanctity of his family. Because he was too familiar with the nasty to separate it from his thinking. His compromise was just as abhorrent as the demands of the wicked. Verse 9. But they said, stand back. And they said, this fellow came to sojourn and he's become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. And then they pressed hard against the man Lot and drew near to break the door down. Now, whatever influence Lot thought he had among the savages of that city, this proved he didn't. Lot was an alien in Sodom. And like playground bullies, these men turned on Lot. They attacked him verbally, and then they approached him physically. They told him to move aside, and when he didn't, they moved him themselves. And in that split second of angry response, they ridicule him, accuse him, and they threaten him because Lot was nothing more to them than a carpetbagger. A self-righteous foreigner who thought he was good enough to cast judgment on his neighbor. You see, Lot was an alien who had come to their world. He was different at first. He was an individual at first, but then he started to dress like them, to play like them. He started to like the same music, the same entertainments, watch the same movies, and he moved closer to them until he shared their zip code. But Lot was still an alien. Lot was always supposed to be an alien, different, individual, set apart. And the people of the city hated him for it. Now, when he calls out their sin is wicked, they turn on him. And they threaten to treat him worse than they intended to treat his guests. And they charge forward at him, pressing so powerfully that the door begins to buckle. Verse 10. But the men reached out their hands and they brought Lot into the house with them and they shut the door. Now there's a barrier, right? Now there's a barrier, but what's that barrier? It's between the righteous and the wicked. Verse 11, and they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great. I want you to try to picture that. Imagine the angel's arm reaching out beyond the door, yanking Lot back into his house, and that door slamming shut. And then every man in the city, from young and old, is struck blind because not one of them repented at the hearing of Lot's appeal. Every one of them suffered the consequences for their sinful decision. We don't really know the extent of the blindness. It may have been a temporary blindness, just lasting long enough for Lot and his family to escape, but it was more, I can assure you this, it was more than just a loss of sight. That phrase, struck with blindness, indicates some sort of flashing light. And every one of those thugs are dazed, knocked senseless, blinded in their sight and their perception. Now I want you to see that. Look at them groping around. Not only can they not see, but they can't even think straight about where it is that they're supposed to be. Now I want you to think, what should be their reaction? How should they respond at that point? Wouldn't you expect them to have some sort of reaction of change immediately? Wait a minute, what's happened? What's happened? Wouldn't you expect them to have some type of fearful remorse that's going to take them over? Wouldn't you expect them to be overcome and then in fearful submission fall down in reverent awe? But instead it just fuels their craving. Look, it says, so they wore themselves out groping for the door. Instead of cooling their lust, they became a caricature of blinded, lust-crazed men stumbling around looking for a door. The wickedness of Sodom is now beyond question. 10 righteous cannot be found in Sodom. As one pastor put it, he said, every mother's son, and by implication, every daughter of Sodom was an unrepentant, hardened sinner. Verse 12. Then the men said to Lot, have you anyone else here? Sons-in-laws, daughters, or anyone in the city, bring them out of this place, for we're about to destroy this place because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So just as it was in the days of Noah, Lot is warned of the impending judgment and then advised to lead his family to a place of safety. His daughters were there with him. There's no mention of his sons. Only sons-in-law remained, and they must be warned. But where are they? Now I want you to think about this for just a minute. We got to warn his sons-in-law. Where are they? Verse 14. So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law who were to marry his daughter. His sons-in-laws are on the other side of the door. They're the very men who were betrothed to his daughters, and they're among the thugs who are trying to break down the door to get to the men in the house. These are the men who are to be his sons-in-law. And now they're floundering around the door, blinded in their wickedness. And even still, the cry to be delivered from God's wrath goes out to them. What mercy God shows. Get up. Get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city. But look, he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. His warning was to no avail. They imagined Lot to be a fool. But think about how foolish that was of them. These boys, think about it. These boys, the exposure they'd been witnessed God's mercy when he used Abraham to deliver them from the kings of the east. They saw that, as did every other person in that city. They'd experienced God's divine power when they were struck with blindness that very night, but they still rejected Lot's warning. Think about the tragedy of that. These boys were betrothed to Lot's daughters. I mean, these are the guys who showed up at his house and ate dinner with him at night. These are the guys who left his home who would one day return as his relatives. These are the guys who would give his daughter's grandchildren to Lot. Surely they've been influenced by living so close to Lot and his family. Surely they have observed Lot's righteousness. They've heard him speak about Abraham's God, the only true and living one. Surely they've been influenced by Lot to this point. Perhaps, though, it was Lot's lukewarm commitment that watered down his godly influence before him. Because when the time came for decision, they rejected Lot's warning. They'd never even heard this kind of stuff come out of Lot's mouth. They never heard Lot talk about a God who was holy and good. They never heard Lot talk about a God that was worthy of being worshiped. And now when the time comes of warning, Lot's a fool. Because to them, and so many like them, divine judgment was just a fear tactic for the weak of mind. They thought it was all a joke, the musings of a senile man. And so verse 15 begins, as morning dawned. You see, the events that took place at Lot's house have subsided. By the time we get to verse 15, the final night in Sodom has come to an end. And the sun has risen over the cities of the plain for the very last time. Now judgment will visit them with a harvest of destruction. So what do we do with our text this morning? Let me say first, make the first point, and that's this. We see that God will not undermine his justice. First thing we see in this text is that God will not undermine his justice. He will not compromise his holiness, and he will not turn away from his wrath. Now, no matter how you spin it, God incinerated Sodom and Gomorrah for their sin, their heinously wicked, moral and social corruption, sins of violent abuse, sexual perversion, and selfish disregard for the poor and needy. So to those who say there is no judgment, Scripture says that history proves otherwise. Peter said in 2 Peter 2, by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, listen, he condemned them to extinction. Hear this, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. The second thing that I'd point out in this text is that in his justice, in his holiness, in the execution of his wrath, there's an unexpected twist to his judgment. And that is that he rescued Lot, a man who compromised his witness, betrayed his family, and forfeited all virtue to worldly ambition. And yet he is described in the New Testament as being righteous. Did you hear that? I want to say it one more time. This is a man who compromised his witness. He betrayed his family. He sold out all of his virtues so that he could pursue the ambitions of the world. And yet, the New Testament looks back at Lot and says he was a righteous man. Good thing I'm not the judge. Because I think Lot is a scary little man. A whimpering fool. But God says he's righteous. You see, I think Lot is a great picture of many of us who call ourselves Christians. I think a lot of us are Lot. When the apostle Peter referred to Lot as being righteous, he said it 3 times. He didn't just say it once. 3 times he said Lot was righteous, but he also called him distressed. He said that he was tormented by the filth that was being lived around him. But his soul was righteous. And there was a disconnect between who he was and where he was. Lot was an alien in Sodom, and that's what I think many Christians are today, aliens in Sodom. Considering what we know about Lot, we get kind of confused, I think, when we talk about that thing about righteous man. But righteous doesn't mean perfect. Like his uncle Abraham, though a man of far less character and commitment, Lot was a believer. But he made some really bad judgment calls. And when given a choice, he chose the land in the well-watered plain of the Jordan because he was attracted to the glitz, to the materialism of Sodom. And then after he was delivered by his uncle from the kings of the east, he returned to Sodom and became more entrenched in the culture. And while the Bible doesn't tell us for sure, and we can't be for certain, some people say that he married a Sodomite woman. And we know for certain that his daughters were betrothed to pagan Sodomites, young men who were involved in pursuing the molestation of Lot's guests, and he welcomed them into his family. Lot was an alien in Sodom, but he let Sodom get inside of him. Before the end of this chapter, we're going to see Lot in a drunken stupor in a mountain cave. And he's going to give in to sin that's reminiscent of the Sodom within him. But again, I say, righteousness doesn't mean perfect. And as imperfect as he was, Lot was righteous because of his faith. But there is one who is both perfect and righteous. And he helps us in our time of need. And that's Jesus, our great high priest, made the one-time perfect sacrifice on the cross. Rather, Hebrews says it this way: for we don't have a high priest who can't sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who's been tempted in every way such as we. And so as our great high priest, Jesus Christ, not only perfectly merciful and faithful, but he's also perfectly, and hear this, some of you need to hear this, he's also perfectly understanding. Though he was the Son of God, his divinity did not prevent him from experiencing our feelings, our emotions, temptations, our pains. And because he's been tempted, he can sympathize with us, compassionate to the point of helping. The writer of Hebrews goes on to say, let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. Listen, friend, God rescued righteous Lot, and he'll rescue you also. Because he comes to the aid of the faithful and of the foolish saint. I've got a good friend that I had the privilege of working on his staff, Kevin Ham, who's now the pastor at Gardendale's First Baptist Church. And Cheryl was reminding me of a story that he told. I think it's real appropriate, of an experience that he had. He said one day he was sitting in traffic in his car. And the reason for the traffic was he got behind a garbage truck. And so as he's going through, he eventually worked his way up, and he's right behind to where he was right behind the garbage truck. And the garbage truck came to a stop, and the other guy gets out, and there's two men on the back, and he says one of the guys got out, and he did the can. The other guy sat down on the bumper, the rear bumper, and he pulled out a paper bag, and he pulled out a donut. And he sat down on the back bumper of that garbage truck and started eating his donut. And Kevin said, I just looked at that guy. And I just kind of watched him eat that donut in the middle of all that trash right on the back of that garbage truck. He said, I thought to myself, how long did it take him to where he could get used to what was around him, that he could sit there and eat a donut and not be bothered by it? You see, I think a lot of us are like that garbage guy. I think a lot of us are willing to sit on the rear bumper of a garbage truck, the world around us, and act like nothing's going on because we've become so used to it. It's just part of the way we live. Aliens. There's at least one lesson I think we all should learn from our text this morning, and that is that we cannot successfully cohabit with sin. Lot was righteous, but he was oppressed and he was tormented. And it brought great pain to his life. Because, now listen, compromise has consequences. The good news is that the one who was both righteous and perfect has come to rescue us and to offer us another way. To receive the benefit of it, we must simply put our full trust in what he's done for us on the cross. And that message of hope is this. Now listen. The message of hope in Jesus Christ, it's the same message from Genesis to Revelation to right here today. And that is that God is the holy and righteous creator. That every one of us has sinned against his will. But Jesus Christ is the merciful Redeemer. And there's only one way to be restored to God's favor. You need to leave Sodom behind. Get out of that place and let Christ get that place out of you. Amen? Let's pray.
Thank you for listening to this resource provided by Westwood Baptist Church. While we are so glad you were able to listen, we encourage you not to allow this to take the place of you attending a local church. If you would like more info on Westwood, follow us on social media at Westwood Life, or visit us online at westwoodlife.org.